This session, which is called A World of Chaos, where we'll be touching on a wide range of issues: austerity in Europe, imperialist wars, and the Arab Spring, and also talking about some of the issues that came up this morning. So, Kevin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rukaya. Thank you, everybody. It is a very wide range of issues, and so what I'm going to try to do is touch on those issues in a sense from the perspective, from the point of view that we were looking at things this morning, as to what we're trying to achieve with respect as a party and what we're trying to achieve in Britain more widely in effecting a political change. And it is indeed a world very, very much in chaos. In the Sahel region of Africa, there are now millions of people facing starvation as a consequence of the decades of underdevelopment and backward development and so on, combined with the global economic crisis. Barely making the news unless there's some piracy operation capturing a ship off the Horn of Africa is the fact that Somalia as a country has been essentially written off by the powers that be around the world, prepared to accept a country which is invaded, invaded again by its neighbours, and very, very little said about it except insofar as this, an act of piracy, or in scapegoating Somali refugees who managed to find their way to Britain. In India, one of the most populous countries in the world, the fact that the years of economic growth are now stuttering to a halt means that tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people face being thrown back into absolute poverty, even as they face massive exploitation in cities like Mumbai during the so-called good years, which have led to golf courses on the one hand and shanty towns on the other. And it's a world which still remains very much shaped by ongoing war and the threat of war. And I wanted to start with that because that, in a sense, is where respect started from. It emerged out of the great anti-war movement that Salma and others spoke about this morning. But I didn't want to start with the Iraq War, more with the Afghan War, which was unleashed on the people of Afghanistan and now spreading, in essence, to large numbers of people in Pakistan, just weeks after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. Because it's maybe the case now that you can barely find a politician who will defend the Iraq War, and those who try to defend the Afghan War end up having to call it a mission and saying very little about it and so on. But at the time, that wasn't the case in September and October of 2000 and 2001. There was a gathering head of steam that the people who were prepared to stand out against that war were not a majority. In fact, it was a minority of us, comprising three different elements in a sense. One, the part of the left in Britain, of the socialists, the people who in their ideology, in our ideology, are set against the system of war and exploitation, who were clear enough sighted to see that this war would be a disaster and to stand up to all of the propaganda, along with the traditional peace movement in Britain, above all the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which had by coincidence been organising a demonstration not around 9/11 of course because it hadn't happened, but around peace and for disarmament more generally, and became an instrumental part, a pillar of that coalition against the war. And beyond those two layers, large numbers of the Muslim communities in Britain, in their majority hailing from Pakistan and South Asia, and having quite a good idea, a very good idea, about what British, in particular, imperial intervention would mean in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and so on. I go back there because it shows the absolute premium, in my view, of why we need to continue to take a principled stand against war and, as Micaiah puts it, against imperialist domination of the globe. Imperialist domination of the globe being quite simply the attempt to carve up the whole world and its resources in the interests of the 1% in the society, principally the 1% in the richest countries in the world. And this morning we had a very good example, if people heard it on the radio, which is where I heard it, of what the interconnections are. You know, Tony Blair, who didn't really need much persuading to go to war in Iraq, he was committed himself, but just in case he wasn't committed, Rupert Murdoch phoned him 3 times in the run-up to the decision to go to war in order to press the hard right Republican case in the United States so there'd be no wobbling from Downing Street. One of the world's global media barons, corrupted, exploitative, divisive amongst the people more generally, in alliance with the most powerful states to carve up the globe. And that clear opposition to war and imperialism remains a very, very important strand throughout what Respect stands for. And it's something, I think, which we need to often restate and often return to, because the arguments that are put for wars and interventions change or are reheated. So that, for example, the arguments that were put around Afghanistan, now it's very, very difficult to make those wash. You know, we go there to liberate women, except we're bombing wedding parties, and the president that's been imposed in Afghanistan is a president who believes in legalising rape within marriage, hardly something which can be described as benefiting women. So these arguments are falling apart, hence the fact that when in Bradford, in particular the BBC, tried to make our opposition to the Afghan war a vote loser, in fact it turned into a vote winner, and the Labour candidate Imran Hussain was acutely embarrassed by the fact that he supported the Afghan war. But the arguments come up in many different ways, and in particular they're coming up now inside the Middle East in a new way for new forms of intervention inside of the Middle East region. And they're coming up because as part of this world in chaos, this world in crisis, there is globally different parts of the world, it's at different levels, different trigger points, it's uneven and so on. There is a sense of resistance to austerity, resistance to the globalised capitalism, and a resistance to the imperialist powers. And that was seen spectacularly as we were all glued to the TV sets for 18 days last year with the fall of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, a man who'd been in power in Egypt, the most important Arab country, for 30 years, a man who was an instrumental part of the division of the Arab region in the interests of the great powers and their allies in the area, the House of Saud, the Saudi monarchy and others. Overthrown by a popular revolution of people coming out onto the streets, leaving their places of work and so on, and tearing down the dictatorship. But if any of us thought that just the fall of even one very important dictator would undo the many decades of foreign intervention in the region, or so the fall of that dictator and the fact that the Anglo-US occupation of Iraq has ended up in a defeat for those who went to war in Iraq, well, it wasn't going to be as easy as that, because so much is at stake for them. In the Middle East region, half the world's proven oil resources are at stake for them. And so, despite the fact that there's a popular uprising which won an enormous success in Tunisia and in Egypt, there's been a great attempt over the last year to reimpose, to put that back in the bottle, to use, I suppose, an Orientalist phrase about the Arab region, to put the genie back into the bottle, to try and stabilise everything as it was before, to make as limited concessions as they can, and to say that we're in favour of something called an Arab Spring, provided the outcome is societies which are run pretty much like ones in Britain and the United States, and still in the interest of people, of businessmen in Britain and in the United States. So massive interference in the internal affairs of countries, interference in the political forces that have emerged to try and derail them. It was summed up very, very well by Shimon Peres, a senior Israeli politician, who said Well, I'm in favour of the Arab Spring because I'm against the old Arab politics. I'm against Hezbollah in Lebanon. I'm against Hamas. I'm against this idea that there's an Arab revolutionary, an Arab militant tradition fighting to liberate their lands. If we can have an Arab Spring where Walmart opens, where Starbucks opens, where there's normalised relations between Israel and all of its neighbours and so on, then this would be progress indeed. So they had a vision about what it was that they wanted, and a vision which kept the majority of people at the bottom. And what do we find this week? That despite the overthrow of Mubarak, there's the dissolution of the Egyptian parliament. The entire parliament dissolved by a military which still controls the important levers of power in Egypt.